At Thanksgiving, the dining room of our family's estate glowed with tradition. Candles flickered against crystal glasses, the turkey glistened at the center of the long mahogany table, and silverware had been polished until it shone like mirrors. To anyone outside, it looked like a picture-perfect American holiday. But inside, I felt something entirely different. A storm gathering beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension that pressed on my chest with every passing second. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his expression carved in stone. He had always believed himself not just the leader of the family, but the ruler, the one whose word was final. He cleared his throat once, then leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. That silence was heavier than any conversation. Garrett, my older brother, lounged to his right, smiling as though the night were designed for him alone. He lived in the comfort of being the chosen one, certain the future was already written in his favor. Megan, my younger sister, tilted her phone slightly, pretending to scroll, while sneaking snapshots of herself with the Thanksgiving feast as her backdrop. To her, everything was an opportunity to be seen, to be adored by strangers online. And my mother, seated just beside father, swirled her wine in slow circles. Her eyes downcast, her lips pressed tight. She always knew what was coming before the rest of us. She just never stopped it. And then there was me sitting quietly, my smile polite, my thoughts anything but calm. For years, I had been the invisible one, the overlooked daughter whose presence was more tolerated than welcomed. I had grown used to watching rather than speaking, to carrying my thoughts like secrets. But that night, as I studied the faces around the table, I knew something was about to break. My father's eyes swept over us, hard and deliberate, as if he were calculating the weight of each life before him. He tapped his fingers once against the table and everyone froze. It was a habit we had all learned to fear. He loved these moments, the silence before his verdict, the way anticipation made the rest of us small. Tonight, he began, his voice slow and steady. "I have an announcement." No one breathed. Garrett straightened, already grinning like the heir apparent. Megan rolled her eyes, pretending nothing serious could touch her curated world. Mother's glass trembled slightly, though she kept it pressed to her lips. And me, I kept my gaze fixed on him, unblinking, waiting. Because I knew better than anyone else at that table that whatever came next would change everything. My father believed he still had the power to define who I was, to decide what I was worth. But what he didn't know was that I had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the day his words would no longer control me. Have you ever sat at a family gathering where a single sentence shattered the illusion of togetherness? Have you ever felt that the people who should protect you were the very ones preparing to cut you down? If you have, or if you can imagine it, stay with me. Because that Thanksgiving night was not just another holiday. It was the night when masks slipped, when loyalties fractured, and when a truth long buried finally demanded to be heard. My name is Eleanor Adams, though in this house, that name has rarely meant anything. I grew up surrounded by wealth and prestige, yet none of it ever seemed to belong to me. My father built his reputation as a self-made businessman, a man who commanded respect in the city, who owned a company that people whispered about with admiration. To the world, we were the model family, polished, successful, enviable. Inside these walls, however, I was little more than a shadow. Garrett was always presented as the future, the heir, the embodiment of everything my father valued. From the moment he could string together a sentence, my father boasted about him to colleagues and partners, as though his son's very existence justified his legacy. Megan, the youngest, was his darling, his baby girl, who could do no wrong, whose mistakes were brushed aside with indulgent laughter. And me, the middle child, the daughter who never seemed to fit any mold, too opinionated, too thoughtful, too eager to prove myself in ways he didn't care to see. I tried over and over to earn his approval. I studied late into the night, earned grades that should have been celebrated, and developed an eye for strategy and innovation that I believed could strengthen the business. But in a household like mine, effort only mattered if it came from the right person, and I was never the right person. At family dinners, when Garrett bragged about trivial successes, Father nodded with pride. When Megan chattered about her shallow adventures, he smiled indulgently. When I spoke, his gaze grew distant, as if waiting for the moment I would finish so the real conversation could continue. That invisibility was its own form of punishment, but the deeper wounds came when he did notice me when he chose to cut me down instead of lifting me up. Even as a child, I could feel the weight of his disappointment, the way his approval skipped over me like sunlight passing through glass. To be invisible in your own family is a peculiar kind of pain. It teaches you to listen more than you speak, to carry your victories in silence, to harden yourself against the sting of being ignored. Still, there was a part of me stubborn and unyielding that refused to accept this role forever. I clung to the belief that if I just tried harder, if I proved myself enough, he would see me. That belief carried me through my teenage years until the night when he turned my hope into humiliation. That night, in front of people whose respect I craved, he didn't just dismiss me, he reminded me of exactly where he thought I belonged. Those words have never left me. They became the fuel I carried into adulthood, the memory that haunted every decision I made. And though I sat quietly at the Thanksgiving table years later appearing calm, I was not the same girl he had once silenced. I was something far more dangerous, someone who had learned to turn invisibility into power. In families like mine, injustice was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, disguised as tradition, woven into every holiday toast and every boardroom meeting. Garrett was praised for his confidence, even when it was arrogance. Megan was adored for her charm, even when it was manipulation. And I was tolerated at best, an afterthought at worst. My father's favoritism wasn't subtle. It was sharp and obvious, cutting into me with every decision that left me standing on the outside. I remember one evening more vividly than any other, a night that carved itself into my memory like a scar. I was 15, and the company my father had built was hosting an executive dinner in the grand boardroom downtown. Garrett, barely 17, was invited to sit in not because he had anything to contribute, but because my father wanted to show him off as the heir apparent. I had begged for the chance to attend, certain I could prove my worth if only given the opportunity. At first, my father laughed, but when I persisted, he finally allowed me to come, though I would soon realize it was not a gift but a setup for humiliation. The boardroom was filled with men in tailored suits, the kind who carried their power in the tilt of their chin and the weight of their cufflinks. They looked at me with mild amusement, as though wondering why a schoolgirl had been allowed into their sacred space. I ignored their glances, clutched my notes, and when the moment came, I stood to present an idea I had worked on for weeks, a plan to modernize the company's aging software systems. My voice shook at first, but I steadied myself. I explained how technology was moving faster than our company was keeping up, how automation could save millions, how innovation could secure our future. I thought for a flicker of a second that someone might actually listen. Then came the sound that silenced me forever, the crack of my father's palm slamming against the table. The glasses rattled and all eyes turned to him. His face was red, his voice thunderous. "Eleanor, stop embarrassing yourself," he said, each word heavy with disdain. "You will never be as good as your brother. Business is for men. Learn your place." Laughter erupted around the room, low and cruel. Garrett smirked in satisfaction, basking in the affirmation. I stood frozen, my cheeks burning, my throat closing. I wanted to speak, to fight back, but my father's glare pinned me in silence. My mother sat at the end of the table, her wine glass halfway to her lips, her eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth. She said nothing. She always said nothing. That silence was louder than his words. I sat back down, folding my notes with trembling hands, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. In that moment, I was not just ignored, I was erased. The humiliation clung to me long after the meeting ended, long after the suits had finished laughing, long after Garrett strutted out, as though the night had been designed for him. That night marked the end of my hope for his approval. It was the night I realized my father would never see me as an equal, never see me as worthy. It was the night I learned that to survive in this family, I could not wait for validation. I would have to take it. That memory came back to me every holiday, every family dinner where my father made a show of Garrett's triumphs, and Megan's antics while pretending I barely existed. It lived inside me as a wound and as a weapon. Sitting at the Thanksgiving table years later, as his voice once again filled the room with that same authority, I could almost hear the echo of that slap on the table. But what he did not know was that I had transformed that humiliation into resolve. I had carried his words like fuel, and one day that fuel would burn down the very pedestal he thought he stood on. The humiliation in that boardroom should have been enough to harden me forever, but I was still young then, still clinging to a naive hope that one day my father would see my worth. So I tried again and again, only to find that each attempt ended in a sharper cut, a deeper scar. By the time I was 18, I had stopped hoping for praise. All I wanted was to avoid the sting of his ridicule. But that restraint didn't last because life in our house was built on comparison, and comparisons always ended with me on the losing side. The breaking point came during another family gathering, one that mirrored the same polished setting as Thanksgiving, but carried none of its warmth. My father had invited several business partners to celebrate Garrett's acceptance into an Ivy League school, though Garrett had coasted into it with minimal effort. I had worked tirelessly applying myself to academics with a rigor Garrett never matched, and I had earned admission to a top university on my own merit. I thought foolishly that perhaps my father would acknowledge it. When I arrived at the celebration dressed neatly carrying the letter that represented years of study, I waited for the moment when I could share it. The evening stretched on, filled with laughter and clinking glasses. And finally, I gathered the courage to speak. "I received news today," I said, holding the letter tightly in my hands. "I've been accepted to Columbia." The words hung in the air for a moment, and a few guests murmured politely. But before I could feel the pride I had earned, my father's laugh cut through the room. "Columbia," he said, shaking his head. "That's fine, Eleanor, but it's not Harvard. Garrett will carry the family name with honor. You will simply occupy your time." The dismissal was sharp, but what followed was worse. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with that familiar cruelty. "No one cares where the daughter goes. Business is not for you. That's why Garrett is the heir. That's why Megan will marry well. And you, well, perhaps you'll learn to be grateful for the scraps." The room chuckled at his words, and Garrett smirked, basking in the glow of his triumph. Megan giggled, pretending to hide behind her hand, though her eyes sparkled with glee. My mother lifted her glass once more, silent, detached, complicit. I felt the heat rise in my face, my throat tightening with shame and fury. My acceptance letter, crumpled in my hand, the symbol of everything I had achieved, reduced to nothing in the eyes of the man whose approval I had once thought I needed. In that moment, something inside me broke. The last thread, tethering me to this house, to this family, snapped. I realized I could no longer live in the shadow of his disdain, no longer wait for validation that would never come. I excused myself from the table, quietly ignoring the smirks and whispers. I walked upstairs, packed a single bag, and left that very night. As I closed the heavy front door behind me, the sound echoed in my chest like finality. I did not say goodbye. I did not look back. I stepped into the cold air with nothing but a few belongings and the fire of humiliation burning hotter than ever before. My father believed I would crawl back within weeks, begging for forgiveness, asking for scraps. What he did not know was that I had no intention of returning until I could return on my own terms, until the very name he tried to erase became the name he could no longer ignore. That night, I left as the forgotten daughter. One day, I promised myself I would come back as something entirely different. The night I left my family's house, the air outside felt sharper than I remembered, as if the cold itself was testing whether I had the strength to stand alone. My suitcase was small, stuffed only with essentials, yet it felt heavier than the years of humiliation I carried. The driveway stretched out like a runway of silence, and as I walked away from the glowing windows of the estate, I told myself I was not walking into exile. I was walking into freedom. That was the lie I repeated to soothe the sting of leaving everything behind, though the truth revealed itself quickly. Freedom was not glamorous. It was gritty, lonely, and cold. I rented a room in a crumbling apartment building on the edge of the city, a place where the walls were stained with years of smoke and despair. My mattress sagged in the middle, the radiator clanked, but never truly warmed the space, and the sound of neighbors arguing through thin walls became the soundtrack to my nights. I took the first job I could find serving coffee and wiping counters at a downtown diner. The hours were long, the pay barely enough to cover rent, and the customers treated me like part of the furniture. After years of polished silverware and crystal chandeliers, I now scrubbed grease from chipped plates and swept crumbs from linoleum floors. And yet, in the monotony of those shifts, I felt something I had never felt at home: dignity. No one here knew my last name. No one compared me to Garrett. No one dismissed me because I was not a man. Here I was, simply Eleanor, the girl who worked the morning rush and the midnight shift. It was humbling and it was exhausting. Every night I returned to my tiny room with aching feet and an emptiness in my stomach that a cheap bowl of noodles barely filled. I studied after work, poring over textbooks by the light of a flickering lamp. While Garrett partied in dorm rooms paid for by our father, I memorized formulas and coded late into the night, determined to build a future that no one could strip away from me. Some nights the weight of loneliness crushed me. I would lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if my father was right, if I had made a mistake, if I was destined to crawl back and beg for the place he promised I never had. But in those moments of doubt, I remembered his voice, sharp and cruel. "You will never be as good as your brother. Business is for men. Learn your place." The memory stung like fresh salt on an old wound, but it also hardened me. I whispered to myself in the dark, "I will never go back. Not until I can return as someone he cannot ignore." That promise became my anchor. I picked up extra shifts, saved every dollar, and applied for internships that paid pennies but offered knowledge. I spent mornings serving eggs and evenings learning programming languages. When my body begged for rest, I pushed harder because failure was not an option. I knew my family expected me to collapse under the weight of reality to prove them right. Every day I survived was proof that they were wrong. Those first months stripped me of comfort, of illusion, of the safety net I had once taken for granted. But they also gave me something more valuable than anything my father could have handed me: resilience. In that tiny apartment with its peeling paint and leaky faucet, I began to understand the kind of person I was becoming. Not the invisible daughter, not the forgotten one, but a woman who would build her own legacy from nothing. And though the journey stretched dauntingly before me, one truth guided me: if I had endured his contempt, I could endure anything. The first year away from my family was a lesson in survival, a relentless test of endurance. I worked 2 jobs: mornings at the diner and evenings at a copy shop that smelled perpetually of ink and burnt paper. My fingers were always stained with toner. My uniform always carried the scent of coffee, and my eyes carried the shadows of sleepless nights. Still, I pushed forward. Every paycheck went directly into rent and tuition. There were weeks when I had only a few dollars left for food, when dinner meant nothing more than instant noodles or stale bread from the discount bin. I learned to stretch every penny until it screamed. My clothes came from thrift stores, my shoes had holes in the soles, and yet I walked miles each day to classes refusing to let appearances decide my worth. While Garrett posed for photographs at galas and Megan broadcast her life through carefully curated snapshots, I lived in anonymity. No one clapped when I submitted a paper on time. No one cheered when I aced an exam. My victories were silent, but they were mine. At night, I studied alone. My body aching from long shifts, my mind heavy with exhaustion, but my heart stubborn with determination. I enrolled in computer science courses drawn to the logic and creativity of coding. The hum of the old laptop I bought secondhand became the soundtrack of my nights. With every line of code I wrote, I felt myself reclaiming something my father had denied me: the belief that I had a place in business, in innovation, in building something meaningful. There were moments of collapse, nights when the fatigue was so overwhelming I fell asleep with my head on the desk, waking hours later with marks from my notebook pressed into my skin. Days when rejection emails piled up from internships I desperately wanted. Moments when the fear that I would never escape poverty clawed at me until I could hardly breathe. But each time I faltered, I remembered the look on my father's face the night he humiliated me, the way his words rang like a verdict. That memory was no longer a wound, it was fuel, and I burned it every single day. Slowly, small doors began to open. A professor noticed my diligence and recommended me for a research assistant position. It paid little, but it gave me access to projects that expanded my skills. Later, a small startup took a chance on me, allowing me to write code late into the night, surrounded by others who were hungry, ambitious, and unafraid of risk. I found for the first time a place where ideas mattered more than family names. I didn't tell anyone my last name. I wanted no connections to the Adams legacy, no shortcuts, no comparisons. If I was going to rise, it would be entirely on my own. Years blurred together in a cycle of work, study, and sacrifice. While others my age enjoyed parties and freedom, I learned the language of sacrifice, the discipline of saying no to everything but progress. There were no holidays, no luxuries, no easy days. But beneath the exhaustion grew a quiet strength. I learned that hunger sharpens focus, that struggle hardens resolve, that obscurity can be the best training ground for greatness. By the time I crossed the stage to accept my degree, I was no longer the girl who had left home with trembling hands. I was someone else, someone my father would never have recognized. And though he still believed me lost, forgotten, perhaps even defeated, I carried within me the certainty that one day he would know exactly what his dismissal had created. Success rarely announces itself with fanfare. For me, it crept in quietly disguised as opportunities that seemed insignificant until they multiplied into something undeniable. The startup that had first taken me on to write late-night code expanded into a small team of dreamers who believed technology could reshape industries. We worked from a cramped office above a bakery fueled by stale bagels and endless pots of coffee. It was nothing glamorous, but to me, it was more thrilling than any polished boardroom my father had ever invited me to watch. There, my ideas mattered. My work carried weight. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was a creator, a builder, someone whose vision could change more than just her own life. I poured myself into every project. Weeks blurred into months, and sleep became a luxury I rarely allowed myself. But the exhaustion was different now. It wasn't the fatigue of serving others, it was the fatigue of creation, of ambition. When our first product launched a piece of software that streamlined logistics for small businesses, I watched in awe as orders rolled in. Companies I had never heard of trusted the lines of code I had written alone in my tiny apartment months before. The validation was intoxicating, but I kept my celebration private. I told no one my last name. I attended meetings under my first name, only letting people assume I was just another hungry entrepreneur with nothing to lose. That anonymity was my shield, protecting me from any association with the Adams legacy. I wanted my work to stand on its own. As the company grew, investors began to take notice. I sat in meetings with men in suits like the ones who had laughed at me years ago, only this time they were listening. They leaned in when I spoke, asked questions, nodded with respect. Some even offered deals that could have catapulted us forward instantly, but I refused the ones that demanded my name, my background, my family. I wasn't ready to be known, not yet. My father still believed I was drifting somewhere in obscurity, struggling to scrape by, maybe even regretting my decision to leave. Garrett, I heard through whispers, boasted constantly about his inevitable takeover of the family business. Megan paraded herself through social media, painting our family as flawless, their wealth as endless. None of them had the faintest idea that I was building something that would one day eclipse everything they held dear. I watched from a distance, keeping tabs quietly. My anger sharpened into focus. Each time Garrett appeared in a magazine article about next-generation leadership, I smiled to myself, knowing the truth he could never imagine. Each time Megan flaunted a new designer bag, I noted the hollowness of her accomplishments. And each time my father made another public appearance, hailed as a titan of industry. I remembered the boardroom humiliation, the laughter, the words that told me I would never belong. They thought they had buried me, but in their neglect, they had given me the soil I needed to grow roots far stronger than theirs. My company expanded steadily, cautiously. We merged with others, acquired smaller startups, and soon our influence stretched across multiple states. Behind the veil of a corporate name, Everest Holdings, I built an empire brick by brick, each decision guided not just by ambition, but by patience. I could have revealed myself earlier. I could have stepped onto a stage, declared my triumph, forced my family to see me. But I held back. The timing had to be perfect. Revenge, I had learned, was not about rushing. It was about precision, about letting the world believe one story until the truth arrived like a thunderclap. At night, alone in my apartment that had now grown into a spacious condo overlooking the city skyline, I would stand at the window and imagine the day my father would realize that the daughter he dismissed as worthless had outbuilt him, outlasted him, outshined every golden child he had ever placed above me. I savored the thought not with bitterness, but with clarity, because this was no longer just about proving myself to him. It was about rewriting the story of my life, about taking back everything that had been stolen from me through years of silence and scorn. And as I looked out at the glowing city lights, I whispered to myself the words I would one day say aloud. You told me business was for men. You told me I would never be as good as my brother. You were wrong. Years passed before I allowed myself to step foot on the estate again. By then, Everest Holdings had quietly become a force a company whispered about in circles my father desperately wanted to impress. But he never connected it to me. He thought I was still gone, drifting somewhere on the margins of life, invisible as ever. That illusion suited me. So when the invitation arrived for Thanksgiving dinner scrawled in my mother's familiar handwriting, I accepted without hesitation. It wasn't curiosity that drew me back. It was strategy. The house looked the same from the outside, tall and proud with its white columns and sprawling lawns, but to me it felt smaller, as though the years away had stripped it of its power. As I walked up the steps, memories of slammed doors and sharp words threatened to pull me under, but I steadied myself. I wasn't the same girl who had left in the middle of the night with a single suitcase. I was returning as someone transformed, though they would never see it until I chose to show them. The door opened to reveal Megan, first her phone, already raised to catch the moment on camera. "Look who decided to show up," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Her hair was perfectly styled, her dress glittered with sequins, and she smelled of perfume so strong it masked the faint scent of alcohol on her breath. Behind her, Garrett appeared broader now. His suit tailored his confidence inflated. He gave me a smirk that carried years of unspoken rivalry. "Didn't think you'd dare show your face here again," he muttered low enough for only me to hear. I smiled unfazed. "Happy Thanksgiving, Garrett." Inside the house was filled with the same lavish decor, the same polished furniture, the same sense of performance. Guests mingled in the foyer, glasses of wine and hand laughter echoing against marble walls. My mother appeared, her smile brittle, her eyes tired. She hugged me quickly, awkwardly, as though she feared my father might see and disapprove. "It's good you came," she whispered, her breath warm with wine. "Things are changing." Her words lingered cryptic and uneasy, but before I could press her, my father's voice thundered from the dining room. "Everyone to the table!" The command silenced the chatter instantly. We filed into the dining room, and I took my seat at the far end, just as I had years ago, the forgotten place reserved for the forgotten child. The long mahogany table glittered with china and crystal, the turkey glistening under the chandelier's light. It was a scene meant for photographs, for appearances, for the illusion of family. But I knew better. The cracks ran deep, and tonight they would break wide open. Garrett sat close to father, his posture arrogant, his smile rehearsed. Megan positioned herself in the best light for her phone-snapping photos between sips of wine. My mother poured herself another glass, avoiding eye contact with anyone. And my father. He sat at the head of the table, the king surveying his kingdom, his expression unreadable. For a while, conversation flowed around the food. Garrett boasted about a new business venture that sounded suspiciously shallow. Megan complained about the stress of social media fame, craving sympathy she didn't deserve. Father listened, nodding occasionally, his eyes flicking to me only once briefly with the same cold detachment I remembered. I remained silent, eating slowly, watching, waiting. The anticipation hung thick in the air, a tension that made even the clinking of silverware sound ominous. I could feel it building the way a storm gathers before the first strike of lightning. Finally, as the plates were cleared and wine glasses refilled, my father set his utensils down with deliberate force. The sound echoed through the room, silencing even Megan's endless tapping on her phone. He leaned back, his gaze sweeping across the table, pausing on each of us, heavy and deliberate. "Tonight," he said slowly, his voice filling the room like a verdict, I have an announcement. The words carried weight, the kind of weight that pressed against the chest that warned of devastation. Garrett straightened, his smile widening as though he already knew what was coming. Megan rolled her eyes, feigning indifference but leaning forward slightly. My mother's hand shook as she refilled her glass, spilling a few drops of wine onto the tablecloth. And me. I simply folded my hands in my lap, calm, patient, because I knew this moment was not his triumph. It was the beginning of his downfall. The dining room held its breath as my father's words settled into silence. His gaze swept the table heavy and commanding, as though daring anyone to interrupt. Garrett leaned forward eagerly, his eyes glittering with expectation. Megan adjusted her phone, ready to capture the moment she assumed would elevate her by association. Mother stared into her glass as if she could drown in the wine before she faced what was coming. My father placed both hands flat on the table, his knuckles pale against the polished wood, and cleared his throat once more. "We are selling the company," he declared, his tone final, unyielding. "The Adams legacy, the business I built with my own hands, will soon belong to someone else." For a moment, no one spoke. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Garrett blinked rapidly as though his ears had betrayed him. "Selling," he repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've been preparing," Father cut him off with a sharp look, the kind that silenced rooms. "You've been preparing nothing," he snapped. "You've coasted on my name, squandered opportunities, and embarrassed this family more times than I can count. You are not fit to run a corner store, let alone the Adams legacy." Garrett's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Megan laughed nervously, trying to lighten the moment. "Well, maybe Garrett isn't ready, but surely you'll leave something for us, right?" She leaned forward, eyes wide with practiced innocence. "A share, a trust, something." Father's eyes narrowed. "You will all get nothing," he said, enunciating every syllable. The words sliced through the room like a blade. Megan's smile faltered instantly, her phone slipping from her hand onto the table with a dull thud. "Nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "After everything?" Mother finally lifted her head, her lips parted as though to speak, but she stopped herself, her hand shaking as she set the glass down. Garrett slammed his fist against the table. "You can't do this. You can't erase us out of the business." His voice cracked equal parts rage and panic. Father leaned back, his expression cold and immovable. "Watch me," he said simply. "This company is mine, to give, mine, to take, mine, to sell. None of you have earned the right to inherit it. Not one." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Megan beginning to cry, her mascara streaking down her cheeks as she muttered, "But I built my whole life around this." "Everyone expects me to. Everyone expects nothing from you," Father said harshly, cutting her off. "You are a distraction, a vanity project in heels. Do not mistake attention for achievement." Megan's sobs grew louder, echoing in the vaulted room, while Garrett stood his chair scraping violently against the floor. "I gave my life to this company," he shouted, though we all knew the truth that he had coasted, partied, wasted his father's money on reckless ventures. "I am your son, your heir." Father's face darkened, his voice dropping to a growl. "You are nothing but a liability, and liabilities get cut." The room trembled under his words. Garrett sat back down slowly, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Megan's tears continued to fall, her hands clutching her phone as though the screen could somehow offer rescue. Mother lifted her glass once more, but this time her hand was too unsteady. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, a dark stain spreading like blood. And through it all, I sat still, my expression calm, though inside me the storm raged. I had waited years for this moment, years to watch the pedestal crack beneath him. But even I had not anticipated how ruthlessly he would strip them of everything. It was as though he delighted in the destruction and the shock and despair that his words created. "The deal is nearly done," he continued, his voice smoother now, almost triumphant. "By next month, the papers will be signed and Adams Software will no longer belong to this family. It will belong to someone who actually understands value, discipline, and strength." His eyes scanned the table once more, resting on each of us as though daring us to challenge him. No one spoke. Garrett seethed. Megan wept. Mother drank, and I sat quietly, my pulse steady. Because unlike the rest of them, I knew exactly who that buyer was. And when the time came to reveal it, the shock that had just shattered this table would pale in comparison. The silence after my father's announcement felt heavier than the ornate chandelier above our heads. Garrett's jaw clenched so tightly I could hear the faint grind of his teeth. Megan dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, streaks of mascara staining the linen like ink blotting an ugly truth. Mother stared at the spreading wine stain on the tablecloth, her face pale, her silence a familiar act of self-preservation. But underneath the hush, a single question burned in all their minds. Garrett spoke first, his voice raw with disbelief. "If you're selling," he demanded, leaning across the table, "then who in their right mind would buy this company from you and cut us out?" My father's lips curled into something close to a smile, but it was cold, sharp, designed to wound. "That," he said, "is none of your concern. The papers are nearly signed. All you need to know is that the Adams legacy will be in stronger hands than yours could ever provide." Megan sniffled, her voice breaking. "But people will ask questions. They'll wonder why the children weren't included. Don't you care how this looks?" Father's eyes snapped to her, his glare silencing her instantly. "What people think is irrelevant. I built this empire. I decide its future. Your opinions are noise." Garrett slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware jump. "You can't do this without telling us. You can't just hand everything over to strangers." My father leaned back calm against his rage, his authority radiating like heat from a fire. "Strangers," he said slowly. "At least strangers wouldn't squander opportunity. At least strangers wouldn't disgrace the family name. At least strangers might understand the meaning of work." Garrett's face turned crimson, his fists clenched at his sides. "You always said this business was for us, for the next generation. You lied." My father's reply was cutting, merciless. "I said it was for the worthy. You were never worthy." Megan whimpered softly, burying her face in her hands. The weight of his words pressed down on everyone, thick and suffocating. Still, no one dared ask the question again. No one but me. I let the silence linger, let the tension stretch, savoring the storm building around the table. Finally, in a voice steady and calm, I asked the words they had all been too afraid to utter a second time. "Who is the buyer?" The room shifted, heads turned toward me, surprised to hear my voice at all. Garrett's eyes narrowed as though annoyed that I had broken my usual silence. Megan blinked through her tears, confused. My mother's gaze flickered toward me, wary, uncertain. My father studied me for a long moment, his face unreadable, then gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "It doesn't matter. You wouldn't understand." His words were familiar, the same tone he had always used to cut me down. But this time they slid off me like rain on stone. Inside, I almost laughed because the truth was so close I could taste it. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, letting the question dangle in the air like bait. Garrett leaned toward Father again, his voice rising. "Tell us, who is it? Which competitor? Which vulture do you trust more than your own blood?" Father's eyes flashed. "Enough!" he snapped. "You've embarrassed yourself enough tonight." His declaration was final, his authority absolute. Or so he thought. The others fell into silence again, the question unanswered, but I knew it would return. It would gnaw at them. Keep them awake, fester like a wound they couldn't close. And when the truth came out, when the answer finally fell from my lips, it would not just answer their question, it would shatter their world. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. My father's words still hung in the air, heavy and final. "You will all get nothing." Garrett seethed in silence. Megan's sobs filled the gaps between words, and Mother sat frozen, a statue carved out of resignation and wine. I remained calm, steady, my heartbeat measured because I knew what was about to happen. I had waited years for this moment, constructed it brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, until it stood tall enough to eclipse the very empire my father thought he owned. Now, it was time. I placed my fork down gently, the sound small but sharp enough to draw eyes. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the despair like a blade, I think we deserve to know who the buyer is. Don't you? My father glared at me, his expression dismissive, almost bored. Eleanor, he said with the same condescension he had used all my life, this doesn't concern you. Stay in your lane. Garrett scoffed, rolling his eyes. Don't start pretending you care about the company now. You've been gone for years doing God knows what. Megan sniffled, her voice shrill. Yes, what could you possibly understand about this? Their contempt washed over me like waves against stone. I did not flinch. Instead, I leaned forward, my eyes never leaving my father's. I understand more than you think. In fact, I understand better than anyone at this table. My father's brows furrowed, confusion flickering for the first time. Garrett let out a laugh. Oh, please. Don't tell me you're about to lecture us on business. You couldn't handle the boardroom when you were a teenager, remember? The words were meant to sting, but they only fueled the fire rising inside me. I smiled faintly. Yes, I remember. I remember every word. I remember you telling me I would never be as good as my brother. That business was for men, that I should learn my place. The color drained slightly from my father's face, though he masked it quickly with a scoff. And it seems you finally did. I shook my head slowly, savoring the moment. No, I didn't learn my place. I built it. Silence fell. Even Megan stopped sniffling. Garrett blinked, uncertain, his smirk faltering. My father's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering like the first crack of lightning before a storm. I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady, deliberate. You want to know who the buyer is? I paused, letting the anticipation build until the silence was unbearable. Then I said it. I am the buyer. The words detonated in the room. Megan gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Garrett let out a strangled laugh, but it carried no confidence, only disbelief. You... That's impossible! He barked, shaking his head violently. You don't have the money, the power. Don't I interrupted smoothly. Do you really know what I've been doing all these years, Garrett? Do you know the name Everest Holdings? The color drained from his face as the realization hit the pieces clicking into place too late. Megan's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. My mother finally lifted her head, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. But it was my father's face I watched most closely. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Not disdain, not dismissal, not authority. Fear. His voice cracked just slightly as he spoke. You're Everest. Yes. I said, the weight of years collapsing into that single word. I am Everest Holdings. I built it from nothing. Every line of code, every merger, every acquisition. While you dismissed me, while you told me I was worthless, I was building the empire that now owns yours. My voice rose not in anger, but in triumph. You told me I would never be as good as my brother. That business was for men, that I had no place at this table. Well, Father, I am not just at the table. I own the table. The room erupted in chaos. Garrett shouted, denying, demanding proof, his voice cracking with panic. Megan sobbed harder, muttering about her reputation, her followers, her image. My mother's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor, the sound like punctuation to the truth she had always known but never spoken. And my father, he sat frozen, his authority stripped from him, his power shattered by the very daughter he had once silenced. I met his gaze unblinking and whispered the words I had carried for years. You underestimated me, and that was your greatest mistake. Chaos tore through the dining room like a hurricane. Garrett shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward, his face twisted with rage. You're lying, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. This is some kind of trick. You're trying to humiliate me. Father, tell her she's lying. My father didn't speak. For the first time in my life, he had no words. His silence was more devastating than any denial, and Garrett saw it. His fury turned desperate. You can't do this to me, he screamed. I'm the heir. I've been preparing for this my whole life. I stood slowly, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through his hysteria. Preparing. You mean leeching. You wasted investments, stole from accounts you thought no one noticed. Did you really believe your recklessness left no trail? I have the records, Garrett. Every wire transfer, every false expense. The company board knows. You're not the heir, you're a thief. His face drained of color, his bravado collapsing. That's not true, he whispered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Megan gasped, her mascara-stained face turning toward him. You stole. From the company? Garrett glared at her, desperate, but his silence confirmed everything. Megan's sobs returned louder this time, as if the walls of her carefully curated world were caving in around her. She turned on me next, her voice shrill with hysteria. You can't do this. You don't understand what this means for me. People follow me because of our name, because of the business. If they find out it's gone, if they find out I'm nothing, I cut her off, my tone, merciless. Exactly. You built nothing. You sold illusions, borrowed the shine of a legacy you never earned, and now the truth will strip it away. When the company changes hands, when the name Adams no longer commands admiration, your followers will see you for what you are, an empty facade. She collapsed into her chair, her shoulders shaking, clutching her phone as though it could shield her from reality. Her sobs filled the silence Garrett left behind. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling, laced with years of regret. Eleanor, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help? Her words broke something in me, but only for a moment. I met her eyes, steady, unflinching. Because you never did. You sat in silence while he humiliated me. You watched as he told me I was worthless, that business was for men. You had the power to speak, to stop it, to defend me, but you chose your glass of wine instead. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She whispered, I was afraid. I shook my head slowly. And I was alone. That's the difference. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs muffled her shame, finally surfacing after years of burying it. But it was my father I turned to last. He had not moved his hands, still flat on the table, his face pale, his eyes locked on me with a mixture of disbelief and something darker fear. I stepped closer, my voice low but fierce. You told me I would never be as good as my brother. That business was for men, that I should learn my place. And I did. But it's not the place you imagined. I own everything you built, every brick, every contract, every deal. Your empire is mine. His lips parted as though to argue, but no sound came. For the first time, the man who had dominated every room he entered had been silenced. The power he wielded like a weapon had slipped from his grasp, and he knew it. I leaned closer. My words meant only for him, though the entire table heard. Your greatest mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was teaching me how to fight in silence. You gave me the weapon, and I used it to take everything. He flinched, his jaw tightening, but still he said nothing. The silence was more damning than any outburst. I straightened my eyes, sweeping the table. Garrett shattered, Megan broken, mother drowning in regret, father stripped of power. This was the reckoning. The moment I had envisioned on sleepless nights, the moment that justified every sacrifice. But as I stood there watching them unravel, I realized something I hadn't expected. Victory did not taste sweet. It was bitter, sharp, tinged with the ashes of what had been lost. Revenge had given me justice, but it could not give me peace. The room was heavy with consequences, the family forever fractured. Garrett would face legal charges once the board moved on his theft. Megan's reputation would crumble the moment her illusions were exposed. Mother would carry her guilt like a chain she could never remove. And father, he would live knowing that the daughter he tried to erase had not only surpassed him, but destroyed the empire he had built as proof of his supremacy. I gathered my coat, the silence of the room clinging to me as I moved. This dinner is over, I said quietly, and walked away from the table. Behind me, I heard the sound of Megan's sobs, Garrett's muttered curses, my mother's broken whispers, and my father's hollow silence. None of it stopped me. I stepped into the night air, the cold biting against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The house that once imprisoned me now stood behind me, filled with the echoes of its own ruin. The path before me was mine alone. I had come back to claim my place, and I had taken it. But as I walked into the dark, one truth followed me like a shadow. Revenge ends the story, but it does not heal it. And perhaps that was the final consequence none of us could escape.